Hello everyone, my name is Mark. Welcome back to Mark's Remarks. Today I'm going to be reading a review of The Tao of Pooh by Benjamin Hoff. This is a really bizarre rabbit hole that I went down while reading this book. Um, I feel like this would be great raw material for someone else to make a proper video essay out of this. If they want to cite this, they can go ahead and do it. I kind of left the breadcrumbs in my review, so if you want to follow those and do even more investigation, you can. I found my level of depth into this was more than enough for me, so hopefully it's interesting to you guys as well. Um, anyway, without further ado, let's get started. I'm not sure what I've stumbled across here. Let me explain. The first time I saw this book, it was in my brother's apartment after they had newly moved in, and it was sitting atop a bookshelf. I remember being confused about the premise, and I thought it a little gimmicky, but probably not so bad. I totally forgot about the book until a few days ago when I was scrolling through audiobooks on Libby, the phone app, and I immediately checked out the book and listened to it. Most of my listening experience was while on a walk and while cooking, and the experience was generally quite positive. I found myself laughing at it more often than with it, but for how short it is, that's fine. I noticed on the small cover image for the audiobook, it mentioned a few references. Apparently, it received 2 audiobook awards, as well as mentioning another related book, The Tay of Piglet. Tao Te, get it? I thought this odd having those things on the cover, and decided to look up the awards, of which it did win an audiophile award, but it didn't win the audio award, despite it claiming Audie winner quite clearly. This was the second blatant inaccuracy I found included with the book. The other was in regards to Li Ching Yuan, a Taoist who perpetuated a hoax that he was 256 years old when he died. I thought this obvious hoax was very odd to be included in a book supposedly about Winnie the Pooh and the theology/philosophy of Taoism, but I originally was going to merely mention it in passing. It turns out it's actually somewhat important to understand the book and its author. These weird inaccuracies are. Though this book generally held to the topic at hand, it did sometimes, especially near the end, take veiled jabs at Christianity and the news media, as well as going off on odd historical tangents like that old age hoax. When I looked up his other Taoist book about Piglet, the reviews on Goodreads were very negative, mostly because people were complaining about the author going off on personal/political tangents even more frequently than here. But when I looked up the author himself, things got really strange. Before I explain what I mean, I want to discuss the book at hand a bit more. I've read the Tao Te Ching several times and I adore it. I think it's one of the wisest texts I've read personally. I especially appreciate its focus on wu wei, or to do without doing. The simple act of patience paired with honest observation makes me think of Nebraskan artists and authors such as Reinhold Marxhausen and Ted Kooser. Both of these creatives use a philosophy closer to Zen Buddhism of the great haiku writers, but it has some notable overlap with the Taoism that's described in here. So I'm familiar with these concepts, and I like them a lot. Hoff, the author, helpfully elucidates the differences between knowledge and wisdom, something people definitely need to hear today. That's something I gripe on all the time in my reviews. However, I noticed a lot of tension in Hoff's writing, eventually culminating in a lot of resentment. In the Tao of Pooh, it was most that resentment, it was mostly directed at easy targets that I already mentioned, like organized religions, consumerism, but he also leveled a good amount at intellectuals and professors. Hoff is totally correct in how intellectuals can overcomplicate needlessly, but he overcorrects in his criticism, ultimately oversimplifying to prove his point. Eventually, he makes the non-argument that scholars just write to appear superior. Certainly, that drives some people, but I've met a lot of exceptionally intelligent and honest people in this work, so he's painting with a broad brush. I think that in the context of Taoism, his claim that words keep us from understanding is true to a degree. For example, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. It's a very common quote. But I think it's still oversimplistic to claim this. Words are only misleading if you take them as absolute truth, which only the unwise do in practice. It's the same issue as thinking that relativism is bunk simply because you assume that that means every option is equally valid. That's not what relativists believe, as Rick Roderick points out. That's not what anyone believes. I can forgive the author's, dogmatic assertions, even in the ironic context of bemoaning other people's dogmas like Christianity. The part where I start to back away slowly is when I Googled the author. I was curious if he was criticizing the academy from within the academy, but as far as I can tell, he doesn't hold any advanced degrees. On his Wikipedia page, I read that Hoff, quote, denounced the publishing industry and announced his resignation from book writing in 2006. The source for this was his website, which, in its current state, contains exclusively a litany of grievances, especially the alleged withholding of fan mail by his publishers. I'm especially confused by this latter issue, why this latter issue is such a big deal, as I'd expect a lot of authors probably get annoyed at all the mail, especially when they have bestsellers like he did. I also found the tone of his website odd, given the philosophical concepts like Wu Wei that Hoff elaborated in this book. I do want to point out the hypocrisy, but I really don't want to bully the author in this review. It seems like his life isn't going so well for him. In his farewell essay about writing, which I have linked in my review, he complains in the second person that you have been treated by 2 psychotherapists for clinical depression and grief caused by publishers' mean-spirited, belittling treatment of yourself and your work. You have been given dental care for problems resulting from jaw clenching at night, which began as you watched your last book being butchered. You cracked 2 back teeth and displaced 2 very visible front ones. On his current homepage, he left a note as recently as last year's Valentine's Day that asks for, quote, contributions anyone might be able to send to help me take legal action against Penguin and Abrams for my debilitating depression caused by years of their excessively autocratic behavior, including their complete retention of reader and professional mail addressed to me. It goes on to mention an, quote, expensive divorce, rising costs for rent and other necessities, and years of publishers' rejection of my post-Pooh manuscripts, parentheses, which, as some of these people remarked or strongly implied, they wouldn't publish because the manuscripts weren't about Winnie the Pooh, end parentheses. It's all I can do to pay for essential services, and I can only manage to do that by repeatedly withdrawing money from what little is left of my retirement funds. It's clear to me by now that without legal representation, I will never be granted access to my reader or professional mail or compensated for the years of crippling emotional stress that those 2 publishers above all have put me through. It feels cruel, therefore, to imply that he should just live out the philosophy that he espouses in this book, instead of listing off all his complaints. I hesitate, but I still think the remark is valid. Hoff rightfully attacks worldviews that are theologically anemic and practitioners of said worldviews that are similarly myopic. But the challenge is to walk the walk in our own lives, to pull the plank out of our own eye before criticizing the mote in our neighbors, as some other guy said. Every day I realize in different ways how difficult that is. So this is no judgment of Hoff and where he's at currently. I hope he's able to get some peace and justice because the current state he seems to be in is not very productive. I think the important reminder for us readers is that we all have a best and worst case scenario. We all have vices which, if unchecked, could ruin us. We all have great potential which, if fostered, could make us bestsellers. The difference lies, as Hoff argues, in applying our ideals to real life. The gap between the two, our ideals and the real life, sometimes drift apart into a chasm, and perhaps it's easier to see the chasm in other people's lives rather than our own. Maybe this is why Hoff used Winnie the Pooh rather than his own experience. It's easier for him, and thus for us, to follow along when it's a beloved character rather than some random white guy. I say this as a random white guy myself. The problem, even on this count, is how often Hoff's narrative either departed from Pooh and company, either through inferior historical examples or overly technical language. I would have loved to hear the whole thing in conversation with the characters, like a Platonic dialogue. But too often the author turned from the characters and spoke directly to us, which is where the crack started to show. I do feel it's unfair if publishers only wanted manuscripts from him which dealt with these characters, but at the same time, that's when his writing shone the best. They're not stupid. Either way, best of luck to the author, and moving forward, I'm going to read some of the other Taoist texts that he mentioned in the book. Hopefully that was an interesting review, probably a bit more animated than many of my other ones because there was a lot of drama and that sort of stuff, so this kind of lends itself well to a YouTube video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As usual, thanks for watching. Please don't like or subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.